Hi viewers, welcome to the Grammar Channel. Today we are learning a lesson, the address. The address written by Marga Minko. All about the author, Marga Minko is a Dutch journalist and author. She lived and worked in Amsterdam. She was born on 31st March 1920 in a village near the southwest of Netherlands. The characters in the lesson, the address. The narrator, also the author, Marga Minko, is a Jewish girl who faced the pain, sufferings, and losses, including the irreparable loss of her dear mother in war. She is a brave and courageous girl who faces the challenges of a lonely life after the war is over. Minko is attached to her mother's things, and after returning to her home city, she goes to Mrs. Dorling's to claim her mother's things back. Mrs. Dorling's cold, indifferent, and discouraging behavior further depresses her. She had already suffered many losses, including the irreparable loss of her dear mother. Finally, she decides to leave her mother's things and forget them forever, as the things will evoke her mother's memories more often and make her more miserable. Mrs. Yes, the narrator's mother. The war in Holland proved to be a disaster for her. She was forced to part with all her nice and precious belongings and was exploited by Mrs. Dolan, who promised that her belongings were safe with her, but they never received them again. Also, she couldn't survive the war and died. Mrs. Dolan. Mrs. Dolan is portrayed in the story as an immortal character, immoral character. She was a thief and used the author's and the author's mother's belongings like clothes, utensils, and stuff. Despite promising to only look after them, she just took it away. Mrs. Darling was dishonest. She did not invite Marga to her house to treat her like a good guest. Mrs. Darling's daughter. She is a young woman, very different from her mother, as she politely asked the narrator to come in and made her feel comfortable. Mrs. Darling's daughter also offered her tea and showed the house to her. The theme of the lesson, the address. This chapter centers on a daughter who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the war in Holland. She finds all the objects which evoke memories of her earlier life. However, she decides to leave them all behind and resolves to move on. The story depicts the complex human emotions of intimacy, trust, hope, and betrayal. It speaks of the greed and vices that afflict a human being and how it makes them do horrible things like breaking other people's hopes, lying, stealing, cheating, and the like. Mrs. Darling refuses to return what she took from her friend and do her duty as a friend and responsible human being. She actually used the opportunity to take advantage of her friend's difficult circumstances. This represents the worst of human nature. The background of war and persecution of innocent lives has strong connotations, beautifully foreshadows the story itself. The introduction. This story, the address, is a touching account of a girl who goes in search of her mother's belongings after the Second World War in Holland. But even after finding what she so much wanted to touch, to see, to feel, and remember, she leaves everything behind as it could not bring her dead mother back. She decides to move on and live with only memories of former times. The address that held so much importance till she visited that place lost its value, and the girl realized that it could get her nothing but pain. Now we move on to the summary, the address. The story begins with a narrator coming back to her country after the war to see a woman named Mrs. Dorling. The narrator tells the lady that she is the daughter of Mrs. S and she has come to take her mother's belongings. The lady is surprised to see the narrator and hides herself behind the door, denying knowing anybody by the name of Mrs. S. The narrator, for a moment, believes that she has come to a wrong address, but when she notices the lady wearing her mother's cardigan, she becomes sure that she has come to the right place. The lady closes the door on the narrator. The narrator leaves and goes back to the station. On her way to the station, she remembers her past. In the past, when the narrator had come home, she had found some things missing. On asking, her mother had told her that Mrs. Dolan, an acquaintance of hers, was kind enough to take their valuables with her. She would keep them safely in her house so that during the war, if they had to leave the country, their valuables would be safely kept with her. The narrator got a glimpse of Mrs. Dolan while she was moving out of her house with a heavy suitcase. It was at that time that her mother had told her Mrs. Dolan's address, 46 Marconi Street. As she continued to walk back to the train station, she saw old streets that were burnt up and old memories ran through her body. She decided to make one more try, went back again to Mrs. Dolan's house. This time, a little girl, Mrs. Dolan's daughter, opens the door, invites the narrator into her house. As the narrator moves, she informs that her mother has not burnt tablecloth. The plates and even the silver cutlery was theirs. The narrator feels disgusted to see her things being used and arranged in a tasteless and colorless manner. She realizes that those things were important to her as they were associated with her mother and her past life. Now, disconnected from them and being used so carelessly, those things had no value for her. She leaves without meeting Mrs. Dolan or taking her mother's belongings and consoles herself, thinking that she now lives in a small rented apartment and has no place to keep those things. She decides to go back and forget the address she had let go of and forgotten many sorrowful things about the past. She feels that compared to that, this will be the easiest thing to forget. Now, we move on to the chapter highlights, the address. The narrator decides to visit the address that was given to her by her mother, where all her family's precious possessions were kept safely by Mrs. Dolan. The first time when the narrator visited the address, Mrs. Dolan behaved in the most absurd manner. She refused to recognize the narrator and did not let her enter the house. So, the narrator returns empty-handed. The narrator is reminded of her mother, Mrs. S, who had given this address to her years ago when, in spite of war, they were living in Holland and she saw Mrs. Dolan, who was introduced to her as an old acquaintance of her mother. The narrator noticed many precious items missing from their places. Then Mrs. S told her that Mrs. Dolan was helping her by taking her tablecloth, silver cutlery, antique plates, large vases and crockery to her house to keep in safe, in case they had to leave the house suddenly. The narrator decided to revisit the house of Mrs. Dolan as she felt the urge to see all her mother's belongings. She wanted to touch them, feel them, and remember them. On her second visit to 46 Marconi Street, she could get entry into the house as Mrs. Dolan's 15-year-old daughter opened the door. Her mother was not at home. The girl led her to the living room where the narrator's dismay, things belonging to her mother were arranged in a bad manner. Mrs. Dolan's daughter innocently told the narrator that they were using all the antique plates, crockery, and cutlery. The narrator took an impulsive decision to leave everything behind as the precious objects owned by her mother had lost their value. Also, these objects associated with her mother were now in strange surroundings. The narrator decided to forget her past as it brought back bitter memories. Her mother was no more. to revive the pleasant memories. The narrator walked out of Mrs. Darling's house, deciding that she would never come back to this house to see or take away her family's possessions, as she had no place to keep all of it. Viewers, let's move on to the conclusion part of it. The address by Marga Minko throws light on a multitude of human emotions. On the author's first visit to 46 Marconi Street, that is Mrs. Darling's house, the author was given a cold shoulder by Mrs. Darling. This act of Mrs. Darling is enough to tell us that the author's mother was betrayed by Mrs. Darling.